Good evening, everyone. It's Thursday, October 20th, and this is the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority Board of Directors meeting, and we do have a quorum present. First on our agenda is to approve it, or first in order of business is to approve the agenda. Will someone move it into the record? Ryan, seconded by Rich. Sorry. All in favor, please raise your hand. Any opposed? Wonderful, that was unanimous. Are there any requests at this time for any change in the agenda? Okay, then we will move on to the next area, 1.2, public comment. We don't have anyone in attendance, but if you'd like to participate virtually in the comment section of the meeting, please raise your hand if you're on the computer by clicking the raised hand icon on the bottom of your screen. When the chair is asking for public comment, this will alert the technician monitoring the Zoom webinar that you have raised your hand, and they will read off your name or use the last 3 digits of your phone number when your line has been unmuted. If you're calling in by phone, please dial *9. And the technician will read your name or the last 3 digits of your phone number when your line has been unmuted. Deb, do we have any public comment this evening?
We do. Robert Pulowski, and you are unmuted.
Good evening. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. Robert Pulowski from Southgate, Wayne County. I'm a Wayne County Youth Council member representing District 15, a Citizen Advisory Committee member for the RTA of Southeastern Michigan, and an activist representing all 4 counties in Metro Detroit for public transportation. One thing I want to congratulate this evening is Kathleen Mozak on her promotion to the board chair. I just want to say your work shows for what you've done on the board, and I look forward to all the great work you're going to do as the board chair going forward. But I also would like to publicly say that our former board chair, Eric Mahler, thank you for what you've done as the board chair for the past several years. Your work is shown as the board chairman, and we just want to thank you for all the great service you've done in these past years. The last thing I want to make note is the zero emission buses. I just saw the public hearings go up about a week ago. It's finally needed. We're finally starting to see the zero emission buses come all across the state in each agency, and I'm proud to say that they're finally coming to TheRide, and I just want to thank the entire team for all the work it took to get these in and finally get the public input that's needed to finally start rolling in the service plan in the near future. But look forward to it, and that's all I have. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Deb, is there anyone else? There's not. Okay, then we're going to close public comment, and we're going to move on to 1.3, general announcements. Does anyone have any general announcements that they'd like to share? Then taking a cue that no one wants to make an announcement, I actually have 3. First of all, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Eric Mahler for his role as board chair over the last 7 years. Under your leadership, we've seen the adoption and implementation of policy governance. We've had 2 successful millage campaigns, the long-range plan, and numerous other milestones. And I would like everyone to join me and show our appreciation with a round of applause. The audit task force is forming. We'd like to start in November. We have 1 volunteer. I still need 2 more volunteers for that position. It's an important position because the auditors report directly to the board, not to staff. And so it is a job that we take seriously, and I would love to have a couple more of you on board. And the final thing is that I'd like to announce that we have a new board chairperson, or a new board member. The Ann Arbor City Council, based on the mayor's putting forth the candidate, was Chris Allen from the University of Michigan. He was unable to attend this evening, but he has signed his oath of office card and is ready to go. And we will see him Tuesday at our board retreat, so we can welcome him in person then. And before I close out, just in case, any other announcements? Okay, thank you so much. Next on our agenda is the consent agenda. Item 2, Would somebody please make a motion to approve the consent agenda? Jesse, seconded by Ryan. Motion, want to discuss the motion in any regard? No? Okay, so then all in favor, please raise your hands. Okay, the motion carried unanimously. Next on our agenda is policy monitoring and development, 3.1, board education and policy development. And I would like, you know what, is Rose Mercier with us? Rose is not with us yet. Should we perhaps go on to ownership linkage and come back to it when she arrives? Would that be appropriate?
I would say it's your name on the topic, so if you would rather wait, I'm in favor of that.
I was just basically going to introduce Rose so that we could have a hearty discussion about the advisory memo that she had in our packet. So let's go on and move on to ownership linkage task force update by Mr. Rich Chang.
Hey, everyone. Ooh, look at this. All right. So I am pleased to be in front of you today to really talk about something that we've all been chatting over the years. Mike Alamang and others have brought to our attention. And so it's just more continuation of existing work, and it's around what we're calling the Ownership Linkage Task Force, or OLTF for short. And in the end, it's all around information sharing. And what I'm going to do is basically just give us some background, and then really just maybe a framework that we as a board can start a discussion as to how we want to engage with our different owners. So first, okay, how's this thing? There we go. Okay, some background. So as we all know, there's three primary roles that we as a board have under policy governance. The first one is ownership linkage, the second is policy development, and the third is assurance of performance. And the third one we all kind of know is monitoring reports. The one that this task force is going to focus on is what we're calling ownership linkage. And I guess some definitions soon around that. But some additional background. Overall, it's our role to be the informed voice and agent of ownership. And there's a couple hashtags I threw in here. First one's hashtag values, and the other one's hashtag outcomes, right? And that's the main two kind of focuses of what we as a board are supposed to be doing with our different owners. And some bullet points under that is, for us to successfully do that, we have to really understand the values of that ownership, right? And I'll have a little org chart that kind of shows how all these pieces fit together. But until we really know what those values are, it's really hard for us to set things like policies and ends and the other components of policy government. And then the other part is, we then take those values that we hear and then translate those and pass them on to management. So that's basically on to Matt, who then distills it down into his staff to accomplish those particular goals that we have. And then there's also the other way where we hear things from management and we pass those back onward, upward to our ownership. And that's really what we're calling ownership linkage. So the purpose, right, I'm just gonna read this out, is to have appropriate regular channels for board members to link with legal and moral owners and stakeholders potentially. That's something that we're gonna have a discussion about, with a focus on local municipal governments. And again, we have our hashtags, desired outcomes, and values. So some definitions I thought would be really important for us, because based on conversations that I've had with others, this is kind of a bit of a, it can get a little muddy as to what exactly we're talking about and who belongs in each of these different buckets that we have. So legal owners in Raleigh are the folks that we get money from. And so that's City of Ann Arbor, City of Ypsilanti, and Ypsilanti Township. Our moral owners are basically residents and workers of those different member jurisdictions. So that's beyond just the legal ownership. So for instance, there's in here, you have Pittsville Township and Scioto Township also added to that fray. And then we have potential stakeholders, which are Washtenaw County and maybe the RTA also. And there's three pieces that I also wanted to just recap definitions on policy governance. That is the ends, which is objectives, executive limits, which are, it basically equates to how do we reduce risk, and then of course the means, which is how do things actually get accomplished. So this table, I think, is a really important for us to just kind of visualize and just maybe burn into our brain cells moving forward. And this is something that Matt and I worked on earlier in the year. And it's really kind of like the hierarchy of how we see ownership and accountability occurring, with us, the board, actually being right in the middle. And so the two that we report to directly is the legal owners, who then report to moral owners. And then for us, the downward push is basically we push things to Matt, who then pushes it to the deputy CEOs, who then push it down to the staff. And that's kind of like the hierarchy of how we actually want that ownership and accountability to actually work. Any questions so far on this? Okay. So what does this mean? The board sets policies that include what we hear from our legal owners. Thus, we as a board need to know what the legal owner values are. And one thing we also need to remember is that the CEO's role is really to satisfy us as the whole board and not individual board members. And that's where we talk about board holism. So goals of this overall ownership linkage task force is, one, to help the board in developing policies. So basically we're being agents of our owners. And then also regular channels for learning. So that's also for us to become informed about the values and priorities of those legal owners. The next thing is to help the board create means for linking with our moral owners. So that was, remember in this chart up here, we have legal owners who basically in the end report to moral owners. And then the board can actually use these insights, as we said before, in policy development. And that's where we talk about the ends, what we do, for whom, and at what cost. Additional goals that we have is communication channels with ownership, right? And it's just like, how do we actually open up those discussions of information sharing? Because in the end, what we want to do is make sure that our owners feel that they're informed and we're also informed. So that's the two-way piece that I think is sometimes missing or lacking. And it's not due to lack of effort. It's just, I don't think we've actually formalized a process for this. And one thing is that for that hierarchy, the CEO, of course, can attend these meetings, but in the end, we're the ones that should be driving these interactions with the legal owners in particular. So the last bullet point is the main reason why we're actually going on this journey, is we want to make sure that these increased communications with all parties reduces the comments of we didn't know or we weren't informed. And I think we all would readily admit that during the time of the millage, we were getting quite a few comments on that from folks that have been in this community for a while, and they were just like, wait, what happened with this or what happened with that? And we just want to eliminate those kind of challenges. Some expected benefits, as you can imagine, with our moral, legal owners and stakeholders is increased communications and mutual understanding, and also decreasing or even eliminating knowledge and information holes. For the AAATA, it's increased visibility with our legal owners in particular, because as we know, especially when we're working with the different townships and the cities, they do have folks that rotate through because of elections, and making sure that we're continually in front of them and knowledgeable, or they're knowledgeable of our existence is actually really key and critical for our success moving forward. We definitely want to have regular dialogue with them to make sure that they're in the know of what we're doing, and we also are hearing back from them based on what they're hearing from the moral owners. And then one of the benefits that we see actually is for our board members is around making sure that we're able to shape new and existing policies the way that fits best with what those moral owners are requesting from the legal owners. So the task force composition, of course, there's the board support and there's staff support. I'll start with the easiest one, staff support. The CEO is going to be holding that role. And then as other staff are needed based on what we view as the agenda, they can pull them in. And then on the board support, right now it's me, Jesse, and Susan. And Jesse right now, like his focus would be, of course, the city of Ypsilanti. Susan will be St. Anne Arbor, and then Ypsilanti Township, we're hoping that we'll have someone fill that role. Wink. And then maybe others want to join this too. The terms right now are to be determined. And then overall, we would like to have everyone participate at some point during their tenure, because it actually, we think, helps really well with succession planning. Because as we all know, like for all of us to really hold the role that in our view of that hierarchy, in reality, our legal owners should be coming to us as a board. They can come to us individually, but as a board, we should disseminate the information, make decisions, and then that information goes down to the CEO, in this case, Matt. And they really shouldn't be jumping over us and going directly to Matt with any comments or information that they have. The meeting schedule, This is to be determined, but this is just something we're throwing out there for now, is for the task forces, we meet quarterly, probably about 1 hour a month, most likely virtual or in person to what we want. And then the legal owners is something we have to determine, right? So is it something that we want to have 1 to 3 virtual in-person meetings per year? Most likely an hour at length, because I think that's the attention that we can get from them. And then it's either one-on-one, depending on who it is, or with a subset of committee, for instance, if they want a group of people from the different legal owners. So the target meeting participants, as I mentioned, they can be one-on-one or 1 to as many as we see fit, or the legal owner or the people we're meeting with sees fit. City and Arbor. So again, these are just suggestions. Nothing's been set in stone, but it's just for us to discuss. Right now, we said, City and Arbor. We want to be the city administrator, council members, the mayor, transportation manager, and then potentially other community members. Ypsilanti Township, Township Supervisor, community members, and the City of Ypsilanti, council members, mayor, and maybe community members there too. For Washtenaw County RTA, this came about because of great discussion that you all had getting to this process. Maybe there's folks that we should meet there. And this is something for us to discuss at the very end because they would be considered stakeholders. And we have to kind of figure out, is that something we want to fit in? So a typical meeting structure, I thought this would be helpful for you to kind of outline it. Again, not set in stone, but at least it gives us something, a framework to start with. Again, just want to emphasize that we are the ones actually driving the meeting. So even though Matt and other staff may be there, we actually are the ones that are leading the discussions and taking in most of the comments. And for instance, if we need some operational comments for updates from Matt, then of course we'd have him come in. But in reality, he's more there as an observer than he is actually more as a primary participant. So right now we're seeing, we can go over the policy governance org chart diagram, which I think is really important for them to better understand that hierarchy. We can review moral owner feedback that they get from the community. I think it's really important for us to go over the long range plan with them, because that is something that we just got a millage approved. I'm sure they're going to get a lot of questions from the constituents that we should actually give them some updates there. Ends review, and then any specific topics, which I have a list of that coming up in some future slides. And of course, we can do Q&A with them. So meeting content, topics that we could talk about. Ann Arbor transit-oriented zoning and development goals. Climate Action Office, transportation plans, what's driving those values, the RTA and the Ann Arbor climate millage, and then whatever else that we think. I'm going to ask you all for some suggestions here at the end of this. Questions from us. I'm not going to go through these questions because actually when I get to the end of this, I would prefer that you all just let it be free with any suggestions that you have, and then we'll just add them to these particular questions here. Some updates from us, right? Exactly is the ends. What are the updates that we have on those? Any pertinent monitoring board updates, and then of course, like I said, the long range plan. And then post-meeting, this is like a really important step, right? Because we can take in information, but what do we do with that? And this is where we take action. So one is convey those results to the full board for discussion. And then based on that information that we got back, discern what we need to do. Do we need to adjust any of the policies or ends or executive limits? So for the committee itself, just so you kind of know what we're going to be doing next is we need to finalize the charter document, which the prior slides that I showed was basically built off of that. And you'll have a copy of that in your packet. The version in the packet is actually even old nowadays because in the process of putting this presentation together, I noticed there's some stuff that actually I was like, oh, you know what? I think there's some better ideas around that. Finalize the initial board members that we want to have on this committee. And then after that is determine that ownership stakeholder outreach calendar, right? Because we can form this committee, but until we start figuring out how we're going to meet with these folks, we're not accomplishing what we want to do. So today, what are the questions and discussions that we would like to have? One, do we have the correct participants to provide updates to? And that goes to not just the stakeholders, but also, frankly, the legal and moral, in particular, legal owners. Like, do we have everyone that we think that we should be chatting with? And I personally prefer that we just get as much information, and the committee can kind of distill down. Because there's only so much time in a day. We only have so much time ourselves that we're awake. And so even though we have a long list, we kind of have to kind of prioritize and then maybe chunk things up over time. Should we and can we include stakeholders? Like two of the ones that got added to that is Washtenaw County and the RTA. Maybe there's others, or maybe we go, you know what, we kind of have to draw a line in the sand for now, and the stakeholders, we're just going to have to hold off updating directly on these one-on-one or one-to-end meetings. And then also the inputs and the topics, questions and updates. and any other thoughts. And just an idea actually that came out of a discussion that I had today was, maybe we as a board once a year meet with the public and the board to get some updates so that we can actually connect with the moral owners at that time. And so that is pretty much the initial presentation. So thoughts?
Thank you for that really thorough report. Does everyone or anyone have any questions or concerns or discussion? Go ahead, Jesse.
So one of the things in the previous iteration of the task force that we talked about, as we discussed holding meetings with, or the possibility of holding meetings with individual council members or trustees, was that in those meetings we're getting the opinions, the ideas of an individual on that board, whereas it is the entirety of that body that is actually our owner. It's not like the individuals are not the owners, and it's the entire council. And so I was wondering what kind of thought, I think with that we ended up saying that our ownership linkage was that we would take the decision, that we would monitor the decisions made by those bodies in the same way that we can on this board voice our individual opinions, but when we actually take a vote, that is the voice of the board. So taking that same approach to city councils or the board of trustees is, it didn't make as much sense to us to listen to individuals with their own personal mandate, but more to listen to what they as a entire body decided to do. So I was wondering what kind of thought you put into that, as you're talking about having meetings with individual people on those bodies.
Yeah, no, it's good. So what I'm hearing is #councilholism. That is, I think, is something that we really have to have some deeper discussions about. Because I think the way I view it is we, as the board of the AAATA, I think the constituents that we respond to is a lot different than city council members. I kind of view each of them, and again, this is just me, my thoughts, is that I kind of view each of those city council members as almost like they are representing their entire ward, right? Their specific one, and each one has its own different needs and requests. And so I would like to get as much input in, because for me, I think there's a potential challenge if we get them all in one room. I don't know if we're gonna be able to hear all of them in that particular time. And so I think what I'm getting at is I have no problem going one-on-one with them and getting their input. But based on that, when we do compile everything together, I think it'd be worthwhile maybe is to consider putting that back as a reporter, like, here's a list of things that we heard. Can you, as a city council, maybe rank or group together which ones you view as most important as a community for us? And I think that'll be really dependent on what we want as our approach for focus of how we want to tackle different things. I think we have a comment from Rose, maybe?
Yeah, that's Rose Mercier, our governance coach, is here, and she has her hand raised.
She does. So just like, what a great, really good start. I think the Rich and the task forces or the committee has done. Just a couple comments, and I'm really happy to see as you move through those, the kind of the future oriented questions, because that really is what linkage is about. But also appreciate, because you haven't been engaged in kind of an ongoing or a regular systematic kind of liaison with the councils, is that you probably will start doing, some updates and sharing of information. The caution is, it is really, people are much more likely to be talking about operational stuff, right? That's going to be how, because it's kind of close to mind, right? And so, like that's okay for maybe the first couple, maybe meetings or rounds or something where you can kind of share and build up a rapport and etc. But I would really try to at least, create a sort of, or introduce at least one more future oriented looking thing, so that even if they're talking about this, it's like, do you see that being the same, 5 years down the road or in the next decade, or what do you see as being, that's going to shape or is going to be important vis-a-vis transportation in this community, 5 years from now. Have you thought about that? So that would be my only caution, is to remember that ownership linkage is about ends related, future focused conversations, and not just communications and kind of the public relations. So, but otherwise, I think it's like a great start. So
Thanks, Rose. That's great. And Jesse, yeah, I mean, that's something we'll have to discuss and figure out. But I think that's worthwhile for us to have as a priority discussion topic. So yeah, thanks, Rose, too. Any other questions?
Go ahead, Ryan.
Okay, well, thank you for that presentation, informative. So I do believe we'll have a additional dialogue. Not a commitment yet. So question I have though is, should we find ourselves in another situation where we're having millage inquiries from owners, how might that be handled through the task force? Just as a example, I won't hold you to anything.
So if I understand a scenario saying like if we have in the future we have another millage coming that we want to do, like how we actually handle that?
I'm just saying millage because that was our last kind of
Yeah.
hot topic, but I mean, you can pick the issue.
Well,
but sure.
if we're firing on all cylinders and we're doing what we should do, we really shouldn't have any type of situation where it's just like, oh, there's some new information that our owners don't know about, because the regular communication is to eliminate that kind of scenario. And one of the policies we have is like, there's no surprises. So we as a board really shouldn't get any surprises from the staff, which means that we really shouldn't be surprising our owners with any surprises. So yeah, I mean, that's whether it's a millage or some other stuff. If there's information that we think is going to be a potential sensitive topic or not, I mean, we should just reach out to them. And it doesn't necessarily, in my mind, it doesn't necessarily have to be on our regular meeting cadence. Like there's something that comes up. If we've built enough trust and good dialogue with our different owners, we should be able to reach out to them directly and say like, hey, just so you know, here's this potential situation, and give them an update or ask for requests for action from them at that point.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Simi?
Thanks, Rich. Is your idea and intention with this task force in terms of membership that members, for example, from the city of Ann Arbor are exclusively legal owners? In the sort of vertical bow tie diagram that was put together, the board and legal owners are touching, and I think that makes sense, but there's also the possibility of some discrepancies for the reason Jesse brought up, board holism, and then also moral owners having opinions that might not be captured within those legal owners. So I'm just wondering, is that the intention to only have legal owners in there?
So if I understand the question, I think what you're asking is like, how many megaphones do we actually listen to? So that I think is something that we will, so if we go back right here, right? And so just take City of Ann Arbor, since I'm involved with them. We would probably start off most likely with the mayor, council members, and the city administrator initially, of saying like, hey, we'd like to get your input as to how we should interact with you and your teams. We definitely don't want to get in a situation where we're just getting inputs from everyone in the entire staff tree. But I think if we can set some established processes with them too, where it's just like, I don't know, there's almost like a suggestion box. So they send it to the mayor or their city council or the city administrator. And then when we have those discussions, we go from there. And this is a living document and frankly, like a living process. And so if we find that either we're not getting enough input or our legal owners are coming back and saying like, we're still not feeling like we're on even playing field or we're not being heard, then we just adjust on the fly. But I think, I agree. Like, yeah, I don't want to have my email box getting blown up by everyone, which actually I would love that to an extent in that they're involved and they're interested, right? And so I think from there is just managing that influx of information and going from there.
Thanks. So should our moral owners know that the line of communication is through the legal owners? I imagine some people want to communicate directly with the board, or that's what makes sense in their minds.
I think it depends on the situation, because I know even when we did the millage, we were directly interacting with moral owners, right, with the presentations and the community efforts. I think that is probably something for us as a committee to maybe decide, because I definitely don't want the moral owners to feel like, oh my gosh, I got to go through this bureaucracy, this hierarchy to try and get to the AAATA, which my hard-earned millage money is going toward. So yeah, I mean, that's something that we work with staff to figure out a way that we can interact with them to get that input and feedback.
So I see Mr. Carpenter has his hand up and Ms. Mercier has her hand up to address that issue. You may be talking about the very thing I'm thinking about, so I'm going to go ahead and let Matt go first, and then we'll follow up with Rose.
Sure. I think I caught up with what Mr. Barr was saying. Despite the bow tie graph, which I think is excellent, I do think you guys can and should directly speak to your moral owners as well as the legal owners. I don't think the intention was the residents have to go through city council in order to speak to us. I don't think that was the intent. As a board, you are expected to speak to both legal and moral owners. But you'll probably use different channels in order to do that. That may be what Rose was thinking about saying as well.
Go ahead, Rose.
So yes, and I also just wanted to distinguish for this is that notion of legal owners. If you think about it, that bow tie actually is descriptive of the way authority flows, right? Is that the legal owners have delegated the authority to the board to govern transit authority on their behalf, right? So that's partly, it's in the bylaws, it was in the incorporation, and that the board delegates its authority to the CEO, who in turn delegates it to staff, and accountability flows out the other way. So in fact, as you get back to, the reverse bow tie here, is that the board is accountable to the legal owners. And can also be accountable to the moral owners, but that accountability is different. So you just need to, appreciate that. Because if you think about the legal owners, they're in fact the people who, as I call it, hire and fire the board, right? And the moral owners don't really do that. They actually hire and fire councils, but it's a whole nother subject. But it's just trying to keep some of that nuance and understanding of what the notion of ownership is intended to convey. So
Great. Thanks, Rose. It's helpful. And Matt, too. Kathleen, you had some comments, too?
For me, I also wanted to remind us that we kind of have right now a little bit of a moral ownership linkage going on with the local advisory council with our disabled and senior citizens. So we do have a board liaison that goes and listens and interacts with any public members that may attend the meeting. So that is sort of a toehold, but there is so much more that needs to be done in terms of engaging with our moral owners. And I also wanted to address one thing that I read in here with regards to the phone survey and moral ownership, in terms of that was staff driven. And according to policy governance and our bylaws, something that's staff driven is not really board interaction. So I would like for us to think of other ways that we can engage with them besides staff initiatives.
Great.
Anyone else?
I think
ahead,
I saw
Jesse.
Mike. Oh,
Oh.
sorry. Thought his hand was-
I'm
yeah.
sorry, Mike, I did not see you. Is it okay, Jesse, if we let Mike go? All right, Mike, go ahead.
Oh, might be
You're muted.
Mike.
How's that?
Better.
Okay, first of all, I would really like to thank Rich for taking the initiative to reactivate this task force. And I think he's done a terrific job of putting together the document that he presented to you tonight, and which I think is really excellent, and is a wonderful way to get started again, both for the board members who are newer and haven't gone through this before, and also some of the older, more senior board members. It's a really good start. But another thing I'd like to do is really encourage additional people to volunteer for that task force. It's very important. And it will allow board members to have a real direct effect on the future movement of what the board of directors is going to be doing in an important area. So it would really help to have more board involvement directly on the task force. And they don't have to be just representing their particular jurisdictions, because as we all know, really the board governs as a whole, and not it's just responsible to whoever has reported them. But anyway, I think this is a terrific beginning. Thank you, Rich.
Oh, well, thanks, Mike. Good point. And you actually started this, so I'm just going on your coattails. So thank you.
Yes, Jesse.
I'm glad. I was actually going, that was the point I was going to make, is that, as I work on this, it will be with a mind that we do represent the entire ownership, not, for many reasons, but including the fact that not all the municipalities have proportional representation on this board. And if I were to be the sole person responsible for representing the interests of the city of Ypsilanti, the city of Ypsilanti would be underrepresented, and the same with the township. So I think it's going to be important that I make a very important distinction when I introduce myself to people, that I am not the board representative for Ypsilanti. I am the representative from the city of Ypsilanti, but I am for the entire jurisdiction, for the entire ownership.
No, it's a great distinction. Oh, right.
I just wanted to tag in by way of Ipsy.
Yeah,
That's all.
I got it. No, I mean, that's a really good point. And I think the main reason why we kind of show that lineage right now is because they're most familiar. But yeah, it's like what Mike, Jesse, and everyone and Ryan have said, is that it's all of us, and that's the board holism that we have to represent.
Oh, Rich, this is a really good start. We've had some excellent dialogue this evening, and remember that we're just beginning again. And so there's so much work to be done, but I'm thankful that you've taken on this position that was started by Mr. Alamang, and we look forward to more. When are you thinking you're going to have your first meeting?
That's a really good question. That's to be determined. But
Okay.
I think as maybe if the board, can I set a deadline? Maybe if folks are interested, to let me know if there's any questions, maybe this week or next week, and then maybe by the end of next week we can have that task force finalized, and then from there we can choose some dates. But for me, it's sooner than later. It may be better for us to potentially wait to really go full board, at least until after the upcoming elections. I know people are going to be involved in those initiatives. And then it could be, if we decide as a task force we want to kick it off after the holidays, so in January, that's also up on the table for us to consider. But Matt, I think you had one. You had your hand up, or no? Okay. All right.
Does anyone have anything else? Thank you very much, Rich.
Yep, no worries.
So as we mentioned, our policy governance coach, Rose Mercier, is here with us this evening. She has presented us with a opportunity. She has shared with us her policy, her advisory letter here, and I hope that everyone had a chance to read it and digest it. And really, we're here to see if anyone has any questions for Rose. And also, Rose, if you want to sort of give a little bit of a debrief about what is in your letter.
All right. Well, let me start with I'll start with just an overview. I guess in supporting the work of the monitoring task force, there's been a lot of very excellent work done in preparation. And I think part of, as I say in there, is that we've looked at the way of how can the process be better? How can we make sure that the monitoring reports are also, I guess, providing the information that they should be providing? And how do we ensure that board members are confident in, that they have the skills and the understanding of what monitoring asks of them as a board? And so I've mostly been focusing on the, the process of how do we gather the monitoring data from board members in advance of the meeting, which has been part of it. I mean, I think, under Mike's able chairmanship, we've been really looking at trying to make sure that that's done in an efficient way and in is if you will, a consistent way, so that everybody is looking at the monitoring report through not necessarily the same set of eyes, but using the same criteria. And so part of that was also trying to give myself a benchmark, if you will, of how the board was approaching monitoring and what it was looking at. And so I've certainly looked at more meetings, but I use kind of the September meeting as a starting point and saying, okay, what would I observe? And so there was just in some of that conversation, and I've, made comments or identified some areas that I thought would be useful to pay attention to, both sort of going forward as a board and thinking about how do we ensure, or what, I guess maybe it's for me is okay, what kind of support can I provide for the board that helps them actually, or that supports them in becoming, excellent assessors of monitoring reports? Because it is, as I try to say, is that monitoring is actually is a skill, and it is probably, of all of the skills in policy governance, the skill with the greatest learning curve, because it's a different process than you might use in other boards. It's not activity reporting. It's really about reporting, the degree to which the CEO achieves is in fact implementing the board's policies. And so that's really the board's role, is to say, after we've made those criteria precise in our policies, and we've delegated authority to the CEO to use any reasonable interpretation, how do we then assess whether in fact there's compliance with the reasonable interpretation of policy? So it's, and there are lots of, I guess sort of not nuances around it, but there are a variety of things that come into play. And so what I tried to do is just to outline those to be a bit of a ongoing reference, but also to maybe give rise to or have the opportunity to, ask questions and to really do that. I think that like it's a journey. So we do this on an ongoing basis, but this is more of a starting point, if you will, because I know the committee is going to introduce its process and form to be used going forward. So I'll stop there.
Does anybody have any questions for Rose at this point with regards to her advisory or how we're going to move forward? Okay, Rose, you're going to stay on and, I'm sorry, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's really important for people to study Rose's document very carefully. There's a lot of complicated things in there, and we've been kind of confused about how to go about this, and had differing opinions on that. And I hope that people can read this and agree with the points there, because sometimes really what's happened at the board meeting have not been entirely consistent with the points that she has made. But on the other hand, I think it's really important to know that, and to have a discussion about if there's anything in there that people maybe don't agree with or not sure of, that we should really discuss this at the board meeting and not just say, this is it. We're going to do it this way, and anybody who doesn't do it this way, well, that's too bad. We really need to discuss it. If there's anybody that is not sure about some of the points that Rose makes, I think it's very important to discuss it at the meeting. As I said, I think I pretty much agree with everything she said in there. And I was really intrigued by one idea that I hadn't heard of before. And that she had mentioned that some boards, after they've done the board meeting, after they've actually reviewed the monitoring report, which of course has to do with executive limitations, that next board meeting schedule a discussion specifically of those policies.
That policy.
Pardon?
Go on, go on. Yes, I'm just agreeing with you. Sorry, I forgot my mic was on.
No, those policies that are part of the executive limitations, because as we've said at other board meetings, we really haven't done much to go back and actually look at the policies, and we need to do this. And I think this is a really good way to systematically do it. It's really not feasible at all to try to do it all at once. But I think it's a great idea to try to do it right after we've reviewed a particular policy and specifically the monitoring report, is to perhaps the next month talk about the policy itself, not about the adherence or lack thereof to that policy. To how that, if that policy is okay, if it might be tweaked, if it might, parts of it should be deleted or things added to it. We really have not done this at all in the past, or very little, let me say. So to me, I think that's a great idea, to be able to systematically review those policies, which we really haven't done in the past.
But just if I could,
Of course, Rose.
Madam Chair, is that one of the items that continued to come up with the in the monitoring task force was just that the board hasn't been sort of regularly, systematically looking at policy content. And so when I review a monitoring report prior, if I do, I often will comment on the policy content as well, because some elements of it or some statements that are part of some of the policies are really not complicated, but just are really difficult to try and develop an interpretation of, because they're not really executive limitations, generally speaking. They're either preferred ways of operating, or they're what I would call prescriptive statements, or they belong somewhere else in the board's policies, the idea behind them. And so there's been some input, but then that kind of just stays there. And so it's like trying to, how do you as a board kind of systematically approach policy review, so that they're not just, because times change, right? And so some of the policies that you developed when you implemented policy governance probably merit a look at, and look at, does it still say what we want it to say? Are there things that we've learned through the course of, this policy governance journey we've been on, that suggests we maybe want to, tweak this policy or think about it? And the idea of looking at it, particularly with executive limitations, the month after you monitor it, because that's often when things come up that say, not sure this says what we want it to say, but yeah. I'll stop.
Mr. Carpenter had his hand up earlier. Did you rescind?
Thank you. I'll let the board members go first.
Okay. Which I didn't see which one was first. Go ahead, Jesse.
So I was thinking about holding this comment until we talked about the actual the worksheet, because it does kind of touch on that. But I think the issue that I've struggled with the most is to what extent does the board have discretion in evaluating the metric or the rationale that the CEO uses to justify. So if looking at your letter, you talk about that the CEO needs to provide defensible rationale for the chosen measure, but in our worksheet, That's not something that we're actually asking. We just ask whether or not the measure exists. And I feel like that's where we've kind of, that's where I get stuck, and why we end up kind of spending a lot of time on things is that we have a difference of opinion on the board of whether or not the metric that the CEO used it actually is a defensible or
Yeah.
metric. It meets the standard that we want to hold him to.
Well, okay, so let me unpack that a little bit. One is that I believe, unless the worksheet changed since I last saw it, it actually says, is there a metric, and is there a rationale for that metric?
Right. It asks, is there
Okay.
a rationale? It does not
Well,
say, is the
it's-
rationale good? And
No,
that's a
is it
semantic issue, but
defensible? Yeah, defensible, not good, right? So the defensibility of a rationale is there something beside, let's say, as I call it, the CEO's opinion, that this is a good metric, right? It's saying, this is backed up by, research in this area, or it's backed up because it's comparable to other transit systems that are doing this. It's backed up by, it's not chosen out of thin air. The metric is chosen because there is actually, third-party expertise, et cetera. So it's not saying it's just any old, as I call this, it's not reliant on just, CEO opinion. It's reliant on that there's, as I said, I've already identified that, but that backs up the rationale for that. So the question is, you don't like that rationale. You have to say, does it stand a reasonable person test? Could a reasonable person have used this rationale in order to, I would say, justify the selection of this metric or that? And that's what the board's job is it's the test of reasonability, not do I like it or would I have chosen something else, right?
so the one that I think, I think it's interesting you say that a reasonable person, but not, is this what our ownership wants us to be measuring by?
Yeah, but you're actually, the way, if you think about that linkage, right, that bow tie is that what you've done as a board as a whole, right, is translated values and priorities of your ownership into the criteria that you set out in the policy. So those policies reflect, right, owners' values already. That's the way that you set out those criteria. And those, what you're saying to the CEOs is you're assessing that based on predetermined criteria, not criteria that you're introducing today, or introducing, because of something you've learned in the last, month, let's say. And so that's kind of that piece of saying, if what you're doing through the process of ownership linkage is hearing, values that are kind of different than those that you've currently set out in your policies, is you need to change the policy content, right?
So I don't know that I don't think I'm satisfied by that, because the example that I can most easily draw on is when we talked about in treatment of the riding public, that we have that facilities must be accessible. I don't remember the exact verbiage. And during one report, the CEO stated that he was in compliance, but only through the omission of individual bus stops. And so that required for me, I thought that was not a reasonable interpretation of what our facilities, what we were expecting to be what we were expecting to be compliant.
Mm-hmm.
And that was up to me to interpret. That was not, and I think, perhaps a reasonable person might have said, I do believe our CEO is a reasonable person, and a reasonable person said that, no, we don't, this policy doesn't include bus stops, but so that became a matter of interpretation.
Yeah, although I think it also, as I recall, became a matter of changing the policy as well. And so there is a way of saying is that if the reasonable interpretation doesn't include what we thought it would include when we set out this policy, then we have some options. And one of those is to, in fact, to say the interpretation of this won't be reasonable unless it includes specifically this, and then you record that as a lower level, right? You just add a more detailed level of policy statement. So, I mean, I think that's a probably a good example, Jesse, of where, of saying, you know, when we wrote this policy, and this is one, I guess my comment is you want to go back and look at what's in the policies so that but it's still fair enough to say when we're monitoring this policy, I think a reasonable interpretation would include this. It wasn't there at that point in time, right? So you're saying this is how we wrote this. This is a reasonable interpretation, but going forward, what we want to make sure is that any reasonable interpretation of this policy is specifically addresses bus stops.
Yeah, thank you.
Rich?
Actually, so a couple things, but before I get to the ones I want to chat about, in response to what Jesse's saying, I think that actually brings us to that point of where we talk about board holism, right? So if a member of the board has an issue with an interpretation, then I think we should, maybe the process is that we go like, hey, rest of the board members, do we actually agree that this is an issue?
Yeah.
And then that goes to what you're saying, Rose, is like in the end, whatever it was, we decided, yes, this is something big enough that we want to actually have a policy change. So it's more of how do we move things forward in the future? Because right now, like, you weren't happy with the interpretation. We said, okay, that's great. Because us just, asking Matt for further clarification on a monitoring that were submitted, we're really not going to get anywhere. But I think making that change so that that policy is changed so that we don't have that weirdness that you initially brought to our attention doesn't happen again. Does that make sense, Rose? Is that
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, because it is a bit of with what you're doing, and I appreciate it gets a bit frustrating with some of the not the rigmarole, but the technicalities of it is that once you've set a policy and you've said we'll accept any reasonable interpretation, you get back an interpretation and you're going like, this isn't actually as broad, narrow, etc., as we expected when we set this policy. So going forward, what we really want the policy to say is, and that's how you use those, if you will, the levels of detail of policy, is to say, we actually want to further interpret what we mean by accessible, and that any reasonable interpretation of accessible will actually needs to contain bus stops. And so we write that into our policy.
Mr. Carpenter?
Thank you, and I do recall the discussion that Jesse and I have had, which is, it's interesting because we both agree we want to make all the bus stops accessible. There's no disagreement about like the business goal out there. And I'm listening and I'm trying to pull together a bunch of threads. And Rose, I think, and I struggle with this same sort of teeter-totter moment. I remember comments about the board's ability to judge what I think was called an appropriate degree of compliance, but still accepting any reasonable interpretation. But there's a line there, and I think you said it, and I just, maybe it could be clarified. At what point does a board look at it and say, okay, yeah, this interpretation and evidence is reasonable, it passes the sniff test, but we still want more?
Yeah.
Is that where, rather than shoehorn the additional definition of a bus stop should be a facility into the CEO's interpretation, the board just says, we're going to eliminate all the confusion, we're just write a policy.
Yeah, we're gonna
Bus stops should be accessible.
Yeah.
And it's, then it's out of my hands. It's no longer a CEO interpretation thing. And Jesse and I think, had a good discussion about which one should it go to? Should it be in the interpretation? Is he right in saying that I didn't put it in there? I think I had an explanation for why it wasn't in there. Was it defensible from that perspective? Even if it didn't satisfy everybody on the board. Is it worth going in circles trying to discuss it as an interpretation, or should the board just say, make a policy of it, or discuss it in either of those baskets? Which one is better, and how do you know?
I'm in the latter part of this, which is saying is that if the board as a whole, okay, and this goes back to, I think, Rich's point, is if the board as a whole says that the interpretation will not be reasonable unless bus stops, right, are specified as needing to be accessible, then I say, write it in policy and just make that clear. Because in fact, that's what you're saying. So make that your policy, but don't let that it's like you didn't say that before, so don't, when you assess this monitoring report that's before you, is you're not adding criteria now to the policy. What you're saying is we're going to add criteria, but we're going to add it afterwards. But it's, and you can record that in the minutes of the conversation, but in terms of the criteria that were there, right? The criteria as they were specified in the policy is what you're assessing, whether in fact there's compliance or not.
Go ahead, Jesse.
I just want to, I mean, I think that's kind of it is, because those are two separate questions that were asked here, or two separate goals. One was we want to spend less time discussing monitoring reports, but then there's also a stated goal in here to have fewer policies or go into less detail. And in the example, in the conversation, we just had those two seem to be mutually exclusive, that we're writing new policy, an additional policy in order to prevent further the need for future discussion.
So the question was raised, so all I did was answer this. So the question was raised to me is, could we have fewer policies or less detail? And the answer is always yes, you can, but it may not be that fewer policies or less detail will in fact specify the values that you want to see in those policies. Like I think my comment is that having less policies or making less detailed in order to reduce time should not be your goal. What you really want is, do your policies state or if you will, reflect the values that you hold with respect to, the boundaries of prudence and ethics. All right. So I mean, my goal is, I was asked the question, but my goal would not be to say, I don't think you start reducing time in monitoring by reducing the levels of policy, because I think what will happen is you will end up having a lot of conversations like the one that you're referring to. So I think my column around policy review is more to say, does it say what we want to say given current context, given what we understand to be the values of our owners? Does it reflect that, right?
Rich?
So I'm very process oriented, and I maybe want to throw something out for the board. Looking at our agenda, right? So one of the things, first off, is the name of the document is Board of Directors Meeting Agenda, which to me means that majority of the dialogue and talking, frankly, should be board. And so when I look at, for instance, like the details column, a lot of times there's actually more staff listed in there than actually us. And I think that's maybe something for us to be cognizant of. But maybe a suggestion that I had is like, there's a lot of meaty stuff. For instance, Mike talked about it. It's like we as a board need to review a lot. And this goes to like that second slide in that presentation I put together. Like the three things that we as a board have is ownership linkage, policies, and monitoring. And I'm wondering if maybe for the agenda, for instance, like right now, section 3 is actually splitting section 3 up into 3 individual sections. And the order that I'm going to suggest is there's a very specific reason. So section 3 would be ownership linkage. Right? So that part of that is the OLTF committee giving information. And then like I mentioned in that presentation is that a lot of what we do, we're supposed to be hearing things that comes from the moral and legal owners. And from there decide like, do we need to adjust some policies, have some different ends, executive limits, et cetera. And then the next section would actually be monitoring, because between monitoring and the information that we get from the ownership linkage feedback, that then plays into policy. And that would be the next section after that. And I think that granularity will help us be able to have some like further sections, because right now everything just seems like it's just lumped together, and we don't have any delineation as to what are the different aspects and steps that we should be taking almost like monthly in our board meetings. So I think it's almost like we're talking about our policies. You can't have them to be too general. I think our agenda is maybe a little too general for us to be effective in the organization that I think will allow us to be more effective board members. And then after that, of course, we have the operational stuff that comes from the staff, such as Dina and Matt. But I don't know, I just want to kind of throw that out as a potential idea.
Thank you, Rich. Did you have something, Mr. Carpenter?
Back to Jesse's point, I'm not sure, Rose, I'll be honest, I'm not sure we've really nailed down this matter of if there's a board member who really doesn't like, okay, so let's say I've given an interpretation and evidence that clears the lowest bar. It is reasonable, it is defensible, the evidence is verifiable, but it's not what at least one board member is like, that's not enough. Like, okay, you cleared the lowest bar. Is it more appropriate to discuss the interpretation, or just to sort of say, yeah, okay, that interpretation is fine, clears the low bar. We're going to set another bar higher for you with a new policy or an adjustment to the policy to be more clear about our expectations. Because I feel like that's where Jesse and I kind of been going around in a circle on this bus stop issue. And I believe I have some reasons, I can't recall them exactly, for why I didn't say in my interpretation, make all the bus stops accessible, even though I'm trying to do it. And I feel like we sometimes spend a lot of time on the monitoring because we're sort of stuck in this loop of trying to set the future of the organization in the CEO's interpretation. At that point, it feels like I'm negotiating with board members about my own interpretation, rather than them simply telling me directly what they want. And I'm wondering if there's clarity there. At what point does Jesse just say, yeah, okay, it's a decent interpretation, you cleared the minimum bar, and then look to his fellow board members and say, I'd like to talk about modifying the policy so that our expectations are more specific to the CEO. And I think that would actually, I hope, save us time, because then there would be like no question of quibbling over it. There'd be no question of how I feel about including bus stops in the interpretation. I'm now compelled to do it. It's very clear at this point. And that might smooth out the monitoring thing, and at the same time, help the board with setting the future of the organization. Like, at what point does he say, forget the interpretation, I want to talk policy?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot packed into that. So I wouldn't say, I mean, I guess I kind of struggle with describing a low bar of interpretation. For me, an interpretation either is reasonable or it's not. And it's reasonable because there is as I said, there's a measurement that's been proposed. There's a degree to which how much of that measurement needs to be accomplished, and there in order to have compliance. And there's a rationale for both of those. All right. Where there is a conversation that says, that the interpretation didn't address this, even though it's reasonable, it didn't address this. And I think, from my point of view, as a board member, as other board members, is that unless the interpretation specifies this, it's not reasonable. And at that point in time, right, what you need to be doing is not having a debate about the CEO should include this in the interpretation, is the board should be saying, because that's what that lower level of policy says, is that unless the interpretation specifies this, it's not reasonable. And therefore, just write that into the policy so that the criteria is spelled out, and that you're not, you get up into this conversation about it's not reasonable. Well, it's not reasonable for mine, because it's not, the board is saying, is this reasonable? Not, would I have written a different interpretation? Do I like this? I don't, it just ends up in a funny conversation. But I think there's, yeah, I'd write it into policy if it's clear. And once again, it goes to, it's the board as a whole that writes that policy. And if the board as a whole is saying, this policy, the interpretation of this policy is not reasonable unless it specifies this.
Could I,
Go ahead,
for clarification, that if we get to that point though, Rose,
Mm-hmm.
that a majority of the board feels the interpretation is not reasonable unless it includes whatever, At that point, do they reject the interpretation or do they add to the policy
No, they add to the policy.
to eliminate the lack of clarity?
Mhm.
Okay, I feel like I'm a little closer. Jesse, are we making any progress here?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that in the end we will spend less time talking about whatever the thing at hand is, but I think we could spend it feels kind of, and actually maybe on the whole maybe we will. It kind of sounds like if we're at a place where we're having a long discussion and debate about this, at a certain point, maybe a vote just needs to be called to kind of see where the board comes down on this particular policy. And then the policy obviously needs to be addressed because it was not clearly written enough to get even, consensus among the board.
Yeah, I would say it's not clear enough, or wasn't specific enough that the element of it is like I'm saying, is it's not specific enough to say this absolutely has to be part of the reasonable interpretation. So it's saying, bus stops are accessible, right? Like,
So I guess what I'm thinking is like maybe in the short term, we're like that maybe the next time we deal with any individual policy, we won't necessarily spend any less time talking about it. But if we then address after the fact the reason why we spent so much time talking about it, hopefully we will save time in the long run and prevent future long discussions and those discussions happening year after year.
yeah, I think so, because I think it's part of it is being able to distinguish that. Are we talking about this interpretation being unreasonable, or are we talking about that we haven't specified, or that there's something that we really strongly believe, right, should be reflected in our policy, so there's no question about whether that's in the range of reasonable interpretation or not, then let's state that in our policy. So part of that is just learning to say, yeah, okay, this is what we're talking about here, and distinguishing that so that you actually can, move forward in the conversation. So
I also think, if I might, there's some benefit to the board in using that mechanism to focus on the future, because having that discussion, in my interpretation, is this weird sort of retroactive labeling process, which I don't know if it accomplishes anything. Whereas if you tell me, okay, thank you very much, Mr. CEO, going forward, it will include bus stops. Okay, good, thank you. I got clear marching orders.
Yes, Mike.
Yeah, I think what we're talking about here is a perfect example of why Rose's, what she put in her memo about some boards, the very next meeting, looking at the particular policy that was monitored in the previous meeting. This is a perfect example of there would be a good opportunity at the very next board meeting to discuss that policy. And the way we operate now, there's not a good automatic way of doing that. I think this is a perfect example of why that would be valuable.
Yes, Rich.
Yeah, so actually this is playing well into why I was suggesting like a waterfall approach to our agenda and splitting those up into sections, because if we go first ownership linkage, then monitoring, and then policy, the policy piece, if it's in there every time, one, we can actually add an item that says like, prior policy discussion, or even if it's real time, like we go through a monitoring report, we at least have a delineation that we as a board go, oh, you know what, we really should be thinking about whether the policy as is fits what the current interpretation of that monitoring report is. So that's for me, it's forcing us to actually remember like, oh shoot, we should be taking a look at this particular time, because the holism piece I think is the key part. And I think this is what goes to what Jesse's talking about, like, is the time actually going to be saved or not? It may, if we as a board, when we discuss, we go, you know what, one board member maybe had an issue with that particular one, but the rest of us don't view that, then in my view, that means like we're just not going to discuss that any further. And it may come up in a future, like the next monitoring report, we go, you know what, actually now I think it is maybe an issue that we all agree with. And then when we got to the policy section, we go, okay, now we are going to figure out what changes or rewording that we need to have in this particular policy.
So if I might reframe everything that I think I've heard this evening, is that it's important for the board to be mindful when it's reviewing the monitoring report that's being presented by the CEO, that we review the monitoring report in the criteria that is in the current policy. And if that policy is not meeting our need when we're reading that report, then there's a place actually in our form here where it says, is there something about this policy that doesn't set right with you? Are there changes that you want to make? And then that's how we identify them. And then those are two separate discussions. The first discussion is on the current policy monitoring. Do we think the CZOs was reasonable? Are the metrics defensible, and all of those issues? And then once we decide all of that and we finish up with the monitoring report, we then have a discussion about, I think in the future, this policy did not meet my needs, and this is what I'd like to see. I want to see bus stops. And then we say to the entire board, Mr. Miller wants to see bus stops in the policy. What does the full board feel? And then if the full board wants to take on that discussion, then we talk about whether or not we want to change the policy. Is that what I'm hearing, Rose?
Mhm. Yeah, you might, I think that's a really good process. I think I would still bring it back at the next meeting so that there's some time to think about, not that the discussion, but that there's some time to think about what the policy ought to say.
You've given us a lot to think about. Does anyone have any other questions or thoughts for Ms. Mercier? Rose, are you going to stick around for Mike's presentation?
Yes, I'll be, yeah,
Okay.
that's.
All right, so then that leads us to 3.3, approval of our new survey tool, and that is Mr. Alamang. Mike?
Okay, thank you. As the board knows, I've talked, and the task force has talked at previous board meetings, a number of them, about what we are doing and what we are developing. And we have mentioned that we like this new format for the board to fill out. And you have seen at least a preview of it before. But we, at our last meeting, decided we really need to have the board try it out. We like it. We like it a lot. We've used it 3 or 4 times on different policies. And I'll speak for myself, and I think the other task force members felt that way too. The more we used it, the more we liked it, the better we understood it. It's a little confusing at first, but using it really, really helps. And furthermore, we want the board to try it. This is just the opinion of 3 task force members with the help of Rose. And we sure don't have all the wisdom in the world. And we want to hear, we want the board to use it. We like it. We certainly think it's an improvement, a significant improvement, but there's perhaps some fine tuning that could be done to make it even better. And we really want the board to have the opportunity to use it, see what they think about it, and so that we can talk about that. So attachment number 1 to that item 3.3 in the agenda, of course, is the beginning and the end of this particular report. And I've talked about it a little bit in the past, but let me just briefly recap. Particularly, it would be nice if you had 3.3 attachment 1 in front of you. But for each policy and sub-policy, there are 2 questions to be asked. Number 1, is the interpretation of the policy reasonable? And number 2, is the evidence presented for that policy adherence verifiable? And under each of those 2 questions, there are some criteria to use to answer those questions. For the interpretation reasonable, there happened to be 4. For the evidence verifiable, there happened to be 3. And as we've talked about and came out in this previous discussion, everybody has to frame this in the context of reasonability. And if you see at the very beginning of the form, the instructions emphasizes any reasonable interpretation. So that mind frame has to be used. So for each policy, sub-policy, you first answer yes or no. Is the interpretation reasonable? Yes or no? Is the evidence verifiable? Yes or no? Using that guidance, you answer those questions. If you have a no answer, then you need to explain why you said no. And just go through all the policies and sub-policies, looking at that. Putting in this framework really makes the people on the task force certainly agreed that it made them think better and more clearly and more focused on this, and it really did help. And then after these questions are answered, you can see these additional questions at the end. One of them we've just talked about. First of all, is there any doubt about integrity? And then where the CEO indicated noncompliance, is he making a commitment to following up on that and having a time frame of when he is going to try to make that back into compliance? And then thirdly is what we were just talking about. It's a really good question. This will force us to look at the policy itself. Is there anything you learned in looking at this to think that we need to consider amending the policy itself? And if so, explain what that is. I think this is a perfect follow-up to the discussion that we just had. This is being covered automatically in this new form. Let me also mention, and you can see we have a second attachment there. This happens to be what the three of us did regarding policy 2.11. We did not have unanimity on a few of the sub-policies, as you can see there, and that's fine. But again, we're talking about the board acting as a whole, and obviously, I mean, it's just fine to have some dissension about. Everybody doesn't have to agree about everything. If that was the case, we'd get nothing done. So to me, I don't want to go through any of these answers or anything, but I think it's important to point out there is and there probably should be differences of opinion, and that's fine. Let me also add that one thing that we haven't included in here that the task force has talked about, and I don't think we've come to a stage yet where we are recommending the specific thing, and I hope by the next meeting we will, and that's what do we do how do we vote? Right now we look at the policies and then at the end and have a discussion about them, compliance and non-compliance, and then we vote. Is it A, B, C, fully compliant with some exceptions and so forth. We had some ideas about a different way of doing that, which we weren't yet ready to present to you, and I hope we will be able to do that next time. The next policy to be monitored at the next board meeting, if you see on our agenda, is 2.3, which is cash and investments. And the task force would really like to have the board try using this on that particular policy at the next board meeting. But obviously we can't and shouldn't have to dictate that. And of course, what we want to do is get the board's agreement to do this policy, this way of monitoring the policies at the next board meeting. And we hope that you will agree to that. think that's all I have to say right now, but I would certainly like to have our other two task force members, which is Kathleen and Kyra, comment and give any of their particular insights that haven't already been covered before we open it up for this discussion and questions from the board.
Thank you, Mike, for that. Kyra isn't here this evening, but I'd be happy to share my thoughts. What I think is really important about this form is it addresses the ambiguity that was in the last form. The last form that we used was talking about compliance, and it kind of led down to a meansy rabbit hole in my eyes. And by clarifying what the board is really looking at when they're monitoring these policies, they're already right there. The interpretations, how we're supposed to be thinking, is right there for your eyes to see. You don't have to go back to the board policy manual. You don't have to try to bring it back in your own memory. It's already right there for you. I also like that the forum addresses the very conversation we were having tonight of, once the monitoring report is done, if board members have identified anything about the policy that doesn't address concerns or maybe too meansy or may not be worded appropriately, this form addresses that by the question at the end, and then can bring forth the dialogue of, well, then how does the board as a whole have that same issue? And if we do, how we should be moving forward and re-examining this policy. I also don't necessarily want to volunteer Mike and the policy monitoring task force, but I think that is a good fit for following up with policy, sort of filtering it through a smaller group to be able to focus that dialogue and then bring it back forward. And I don't know if that's appropriate or not, but it is something to consider as we discuss how we are going to improve our monitoring and how we're going to improve our direction. Because the biggest job that we have with, and I agree wholeheartedly with Rich, is we set our ends, which are aspirational, and our long-term goals, and then we have our executive limitations to say, and this is what we want to happen, and these are ways that these are things that we think are imprudent or illegal, and we don't want these things to happen. And then we give it to the CEO so that when he comes back to us with his monitoring reports, then we have to be mindful of he's reporting on what we set forth in the policy. And again, if we're unhappy with the policy, that's not up to the CEO to fix, it's up to us to fix. So I'm going to open it up now for questions. Does anybody have any comments, concerns, or does anybody want to make a motion to put the form forward? Go ahead, Ryan.
I'm completely satisfied with this. And Mike, thank you very much for the presentation. I see no reason why we can't push this forward.
Any others?
I was going to echo the same. I know the task force has put a ton of effort into this, and I think it's now just, let's give it a whirl. And I'm sure maybe there's some changes maybe that comes out of it, but we know you all have been racking your brains doing both monitoring reports every time. So I know I'm definitely appreciative, and I'm willing to let's give it a whirl.
Would someone like to put forth a motion? Jesse? Or you have further discussion?
I have a question. Would the board be amenable to adding the word defensible? If it's a word that Rose uses in her, that I think it is a semantic thing, but I mean, semantic means like the meaning of words. And I think in terms of having had a very long conversation about being clear with our language, I would like to say that, I would like to add that under are the interpretations reasonable, point to say a defensible rationale for the measure or standard. That's using the exact wording that Rose Mercier used in her letter.
So in other words, number 2, a defensible rationale for the measures or standards. So you're just wanting to add that word?
Yeah.
Rose and board, what do you think?
I think that's fine.
Mike?
I'm okay with it.
All right, then we've amended the form to add the word defensible rationale as a measure or standard under point 2 for the interpretations being reasonable. Does anyone have a motion to accept this, put this form into practice with that amendment? Ryan, seconded by Rich. All in, oh, is there any further discussion about the motion itself, not about what we just discussed? Okay, very good. So then, all in favor, raise your hands. Okay, anyone opposed? Seeing no one opposed, that motion passed unanimously. Thank you, everyone, for your hard work. Thank you, Mike, for taking on that task force. I know that it's been something that we identified, and I know we're so tired of hearing about the pandemic, but it really did sort of put a monkey wrench in a lot of our efforts. So I'm really glad that we're moving forward. So thank you very much, Mike. And at this point, do you need to hop off? Or are you going to stay with us?
No, I'm afraid I do, Kathleen, but
Okay.
thank you.
You for all your hard work.
Okay, bye.
So with that being said, we're now moving on to 3.4. Number 2.8, emergency succession is in your packet. And we're going to kick this off to Mr. Carpenter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm pleased to present a hopefully somewhat defensible interpretation. In all honesty, emergency CAO succession is probably the most straightforward policy you have. The evidence is there in your packet. I'll point at Dina Reed and Forrest Yang and Brian Smith, who was here during the majority of the period, and their positions as deputy CEOs as evidence of compliance, and happy to answer any questions you may have.
Does anyone on the board have a question for Mr. Carpenter? Okay, then. So if there is no discussion, we need a recommendation because our current policy is A, B, or C. It sounds like we're recommending A as in compliance. If everyone is in agreement to that, would someone like to bring forth a motion? That would be, go ahead, Jesse.
I'll make a motion that we accept it as A in compliance.
And that would be seconded by Ms. Pauley. Is there any discussion on the motion itself? Seeing none, let's move forward. All those in favor, please raise your hands. And all those opposed? And that passed unanimously. Good work. The next thing on our agenda is 2.11, the construction policy. And again, that is Mr. Carpenter.
Thank you. This is one of the least straightforward policies. Construction is a big topic, and this one is a complicated one. This one has to do with construction, and the intent of the policy is to give the board a final decision on whether or not the agency proceeds with or commits itself to a major construction project on the assumption that that represents a pretty big decision, likely a lot of money, an irreversible construction of something. With this policy, we have noted that during the past year, we haven't built anything, but we did take a couple of steps towards seeking grant funding to build things. And that does fall under this policy because you're supposed to authorize grant applications. We were very successful with 21111 and the RAISE grant application, which is the first one we've done since this policy was passed. We did get your approval on a detailed summation of how we met all the expectations in this policy. However, we also failed on 21111 with an earmark because right after one board meeting, we got notice that there was an earmark window opening up from the federal government, which closed a week before your next meeting. So we were not able to come back to you in your regular schedule. There was simply no meeting to seek your approval. And we recognize that this is going to happen a couple times. So in that particular case, we did submit the earmark in question. It was for the Ypsilanti Transit Center. And right now, I believe Congresswoman Dingle is still carrying that water forward for us. Hopefully, we'll find out by the end of the year. So it represents an important element going forward to try to win these fundings. So in discussions with the Finance Committee, I believe, was it Finance or Service that reviewed this? we recognize that, yes, this is only partially compliant because there were clearly some areas where we didn't meet our own expectations, but geez, it seems, like a good idea. We should be pursuing the money. So based on their feedback, I did add a few things. If you look on page 52 of your packet, I added a new paragraph as part of the interpretation to provide a little bit of wiggle room there in the case of a sudden earmark or funding request. If it's part of your 10-year capital plan that's already been approved by the board, the most recent one, that represents a sort of approval in principle, and you would be okay with us proceeding with that. I think it would probably be okay. I've given you an operational definition of what and why, and maybe it sounds like a defensible rationale for that. I'll leave it up to you as to whether or not that's a reasonably acceptable addition. Also, I did add on page 56, also highlighted in yellow, I had neglected to put a compliance timeline for when we would be becoming compliant with one of those deficiencies. So that's really, I think, the main event of this. The Service Committee, recommended that the board accept the monitoring report as B in compliance, except for the items noted, which I think were noted in the report itself.
Thank you, Mr. Carpenter. We'll open it up for board discussion. Does anyone have any questions or comments or concerns? Go ahead, Rich.
So I think what I'm interpreting or on a hearing is that for 211.1, we as a board might need to think about adjusting the policy to take care of that scenario that Matt ran into, so that, because in reality, I mean, I would say he's in compliance, but by the letter of the words, he was not. Right? And I think we can fix that so it doesn't run into that challenge again in the future.
Jesse.
Yeah, I'd like to see it. I actually felt that he could have reported compliance based on my interpretation of the language. I think that what that means is that we need to clarify the currently ambiguous term of proceeding on a project to maybe somehow delineate that that doesn't mean like seeking funding for an approved project. Maybe with some, when we decide to talk about this project or this policy, maybe, as long as it doesn't commit the authority and doesn't commit us to some action that we haven't already voted on. I think that's really the issue, is having the CEO commit us to action without board approval. But these were kind of open-ended earmarks, is like these appropriations had no strings attached other than just the project that we had already approved. So I guess that's where I see the ambiguity.
Mr. Carpenter.
Sure. The request of a grant, of an earmark or a grant, is definitely an escalation. There's no question. If I go to Congresswoman Dingell and say, I want to build a grain silo for $10 million, and she says yes, all of a sudden this agency is exposed to the awkward risk of saying, "What? Well, we don't build grain silos. What are you doing?" And having to tell Congresswoman Dingell, "Thanks for using your only earmark this year." That's awkward. So I do think there's an appropriate degree of control in this policy that I think is important. Fleshing it out with you going forward, I would be happy to engage with that. And Dina and I also discussed the possibility of perhaps in the budget document, we could try to answer all of the questions that you put forward in 211.1.1 about the scope of the project, why it's necessary. Right now in the capital project descriptions are just paragraphs. We might be able to do this in the budget document. You then approve the budget document. That kind of reinforces that approval in principle, because I think what you want to do is can maintain an acceptable level of control as the board. You want me to get out over our skis, so to speak. But you don't want to restrict our ability as staff to pounce on these funding opportunities when they come up. We should be able to move, like rattlesnake fast to go after this money and not come back to you. I'm sorry about that. Somebody got bit. He's not sure why. There's a story there. Uh, but to go after the money quickly, that's part of why policy governance does the delegation it does. So there may be sort of procedural back end stuff we can do through the budget document itself to have our cake and eat it too here. And I would look forward to working with you guys to figure out what the best mechanism of that is.
Yes, of course, Susan.
Just have a question of clarification. When we receive grants, are there assumptions about the timeline for expenditure? So in the acquisition of a grant, yes, it's a project we all agreed, but is there potential that you have to now spend it within a 5-year period? And we have, as a board, haven't made the decision yet on the timeline. I'm going to try to understand is the expenditure obligation, yes, the project, yes, the funding, but not the timeline. Does that need to be in here? Or is it that because I don't understand the way the grants and earmarks work, they may not have any timeline associated with them. You may have the next 25 years to spend it. And if that's the case, then that's a moot point.
Yeah, and we're primarily talking about competitive federal infrastructure grants here. That's where 99% of these funds would come from in the future. Almost all of them are time restricted. Sometimes it's over the 5-year course of the legislation, sometimes it's shorter, and you can sometimes get continuances, but there is an outside chance I could submit a grant application for BRT, which in the capital plan is years away. That'd be pretty silly. I'm not sure why we would do that. But that could be part of the conversation. But yeah, there is timelines associated with these grants where they need to be spent or at least obligated within a certain period of time, usually measured in years. The shortest is 3.
Yeah, so so that's right on, that's teetering on what I would think of as a policy question, the when of it. And I'm sure that's something that you could work with us on. I mean, I don't think that's a major obstacle, but just it's helpful to understand with clarity how that works. Because again, the way this is stated now, it doesn't speak to that. Again, I wouldn't want us to have that question years, where we obligate ourselves to a timeline when the board hasn't yet made the timeline decision. So I think we're all on the same page.
Rich?
So what I'm hearing is, or I guess what I'm asking the board, is this something we think we should look at a policy wording change for this? And if so, who's tracking these tasks?
So my thought is, based on our discussion this evening, first we should put to bed the issue of the policy monitor itself from Mr. Carpenter. And then once we decide the compliance and level and vote on that, then I think the next discussion, the appropriate discussion, would then be the question that you just raised. Do we need to look at the policy when, where, and whom? Is there any more questions for Mr. Carpenter with regards to the policy? Yes, Simi.
Yeah, I've got a question about the policy, and being relatively new to policy governance, forgive me if there's a better time or place to bring this up, but with my background, I'm interested in the environmental responsibility aspect of the policy, and I see in your interpretation, all I really saw about the environmentally responsible compliance piece seemed to come from correspondence from the Federal Transit Agency. And I'm just wondering if that's the correct understanding, or if we've built out further what environmentally responsible construction looks like.
Can you please share the page that you're looking at or the paragraph?
Packet page 51 in the interpretation under 2.11. It's the final paragraph on that page.
Okay. Matt, when you're ready.
Yes, thank you. So this refers to a large body of federal regulation pertaining to the environmental aspects to any federally funded construction projects. NEPA laws, National Environmental Protection Act, does set out a lot of standards there. So we're basically saying as long as we clear that bar, compliant. This is a good example where, that's maybe not the highest bar that could be set. And the board might want, could have a conversation about, would you be happier with a higher bar? But I do believe, in direct answer to your question, yeah, this is the only place where that would appear, and that is the only place in the interpretation where I've set a standard for what that means.
Great, thank you. So it's my understanding that might be a place for, sub-bullets within policy, potentially. Is there any way of learning more about what that means from the Federal Transit Agency, what their idea of environmental compliance is? Where could we get that information?
Certainly. This might be a good board education or work plan item going forward. Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the National Environmental Protection Act, all of these pieces of federal regulation are extensive, intrusive into projects. They define how the project is done, public involvement requirements. I mean, it's a big element. However, there are many communities I know that don't think it goes far enough. It does not mandate LEED's platinum construction, for example. It doesn't even talk about that sort of a standard. So there's plenty that could be discussed in that area, and if the board wants to dig into that, that's certainly an area for exploration.
Thanks.
Any further questions or discussion? Would someone like to put forth a motion? I believe what I've heard is we're looking at B as in compliance with items except for as noted, which we've discussed this evening. If the board is comfortable with that, would someone like to make a motion? Jesse?
Yes, I'd like to move that we accept this report as B in compliance, except as items noted by the CEO.
Do I have a second? That would be Rich, thank you. Is there any discussion on the motion itself? Seeing no discussion, I'm going to ask if everyone is in agreement, please raise your hand and say aye. Okay, it looks like we have 100% that it went by completely. Thank you so much for that. And then now at this point, I think we could have that discussion about moving forward with policy. Perhaps we should take the suggestion of our governance coach and make that an agenda item for next time so that people can think about the policy as written and what changes you might like to see. Or wording and things like that. I don't know that now would be the most appropriate time, given we don't have everybody with us, and but it will still be fresh enough in our minds next month if the board is amenable to that. Okay, let's do that. I'm gonna put that on my my sheet here for next month. Thank you, everyone. That was really brilliant. Very good. Thank you, Mr. Carpenter. So now we're going to move on to strategy and operational updates, and we have Ms. Dina Reed with us. Rose, if you want to stay, you're more than welcome, but you're more than welcome to go. Thank you for everything that you've done for us. You're muted.
It was I was going to say, it was a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me to be here. I will
appreciate
leave.
you.
Okay.
And so, Dina, you've been very patient. It is now your time to give us a debrief on the triennial review.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So I just wanted to give you some highlights from the triennial review. You have a debrief in your packet with what I would call an executive summary on the first page, and then the full report as well. So if you haven't had a chance to review it, I'll just hit some highlights for you and then be open to questions. First of all, I just want to point out what a triennial review is. A triennial review is not really considered to be an audit by the FTA. However, it is their way of checking our compliance with FTA regulations. As you know, because we accept federal funding, we have to follow a lot of federal regulations. And this is their way of checking compliance. And they do so every 3 years. The last triennial review we had was in 2018. This one was in 2022 because of the pandemic. So in 2020, I think that the FTA didn't complete all of their reviews because of the pandemic. That rolled into 2021 where they had some makeup work to do. And so they didn't get to us until 2022. I'll also like to mention the kind of the level of effort that goes into the triennial review. This is almost a year-long effort. As an example, the first opportunity we had to engage with the FTA about this triennial review was in the fall of 2021, when they sent us a notification indicating that we would have to submit our initial documents for the triennial review in January of 2022. For many of you, you may remember that we were in the middle of a significant event, a cyber event. And so we requested an extension, and the FTA, as our partner, recognized the difficulty that would cause for us in terms of trying to comply and put our best foot forward and show and demonstrate that compliance given the technical difficulties that we had. So they allowed us to postpone our initial documentation providing until March of 2022. So this process really started as early as December of last year with our staff gathering documents and providing information in 23 areas of review for the FTA. So that is 23 management and program implementation areas of review that they would review. 2 of those areas are not really applicable to ADA, so it's really 21 for us, but that's generally the level of regulation we're talking about. We submitted our documents in March and then had an initial review by the FTA. Then we had feedback from them, and then we moved towards an on-site, what's called an on-site review, which was really a virtual review, but it was 2 weeks of meetings with the FTA, going over the evidence that we provided and the documentation that we provided, and then giving feedback on different things that we needed to they'll ask additional questions. Can you give us more examples of this or less, more of that? So we did that. Then fast forward, so we provided all of that information, and fast forward to September, where they've reviewed all of that information and they give us a final report. This final report then tells us what our deficiencies are. For this round, we had 8 deficiencies in 6 different areas. 2 of those deficiencies were closed before the final report was actually issued. So we really have 6 deficiencies that we are required to provide corrective actions on. And as I mentioned in the report, there are no findings that are beyond the control or our ability to correct. We had no prior issues from no prior findings. So repeat findings are something that could cause a higher level of oversight going forward. It's very important that we not have repeat findings, and we did not have any. So of the 6 deficiencies, none were repeat. We did have fewer findings than were reported in 2018. So in 2018, just as a gauge, and to give you some context, there were 12 findings in 5 different areas. So we reduced the number of initial deficiencies by 4, and as of the final report by half. So we made progress since 2018, and we didn't have any repeats, which was also a very important point to make. We are in good standing with the FTA, and we do not have any known risks to our federal funding as a result of the triennial review. So all in all, I would view this as successful. Couple other just context points. Of the 6 deficiencies that we have to report on, 1/3 of them or 2 of them were noted as top 10 deficiencies for all triennial reviews for fiscal year 22 conducted by the FTA. So just to give you a little background, that the FTA has conducted 214 triennial reviews in 2022. The average number of deficiencies was about 5.3, I think. So we're really close to the average, and they usually tell what the top 10 deficiencies are. And as I mentioned just now, 2 of our 6 were in the top 10. And the reason that is important is because sometimes the FTA will introduce new information or new regulations. They'll introduce new things that we have to follow, and they won't always come directly in the way that we're looking for them. So what happens is we like to look at where we're at in terms of the top 10, because if they're finding those deficiencies significantly across the country, it just implies that maybe those are deficiencies that not that we shouldn't be aware of or we shouldn't be complying with, but it's something that they're really focused on. It's an area where they've either introduced something new or they've made a new focus and drilled down further than they had in the past. So the good news about this really is that actually helps us be in compliance. So we look at this as an opportunity to be better. We will certainly correct these deficiencies with the FTA going forward, and then we'll be looking forward to the next triennial review 3 years from now, where hopefully we will have even less deficiencies than we had this time. That concludes my general report and update debrief on the triennial review. I'm happy to answer questions if you have them.
Board, any discussion or questions? I actually have one if nobody wants to raise their hand right now, and that is, and I think you just clarified it for me. I was fascinated by number 12 and number 13, because those policies have been in our books for years and years and years. And I wondered if that just meant that they changed their focus or changed something about the way they looked at that, because we were compliant in those areas in 2018. So is that what we think happened there?
Yeah, so you mean for procurement P12?
For the Americans with Disability
Oh.
Act, number 12, and number 13, the ADA, the one that had to do with the service dog and the one that had to do with unreasonable suspensions. And I don't ever remember seeing this in the report before. As you said, we didn't have any repeats. And so I'm wondering, you had mentioned that they were having new focuses, if this was one of the new focus areas?
Yes, I would say so. The wording that we had really didn't change. So I do think that they just looked at it differently or more closely. And the number 12, the service animal restriction, was just a couple of words where we said specifically that certain animals should be leashed, and they took exception to that. We did have a consultant that helped us in terms of interpretation with the new level of managers that we had. We had one consultant helping us out to make sure that we were interpreting compliance and providing the proper documentation. And they actually agreed that they thought our language was actually fine. We did in the initial draft report, we did take a little bit of exception to that and ask that they remove the finding, but they left it. And so we're just going to change the wording to comply.
Excellent.
Matt, did you want to say something? I thought I saw your hand.
Go ahead, Matt.
If I might, there is a degree of happenstance that also seems to emerge in these reviews. The Federal Transit Administrator contracts with private companies, usually small businesses, to actually conduct the triannual review. We get a different person every time. And there is a degree of that individual's personal interpretation that does seem to leak in to these things. So you're absolutely correct. The things that showed up for ADA compliance and paratransit compliance have been on our books for probably decades and have probably been just fine for probably like 5 previous triennial reviews. Something this time caught somebody's attention. I don't know that I could say the FTA is hyper-focused on leashes right now. I don't believe they are. I think just somehow it caught somebody's attention, and we're not going to make a federal case out of it. We're just going to say, yeah, let's go along and make everybody happy and check the box.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions, or concerns? Seeing none, this is not a decision, this is just an informational sharing. So thank you, Dina, to you and your team and all the hard work that you put through. I know that, my goodness, when I think about everything that has happened in the last year, to have the triennial review on top of it, you should be commended for that, and I think the board feels the same way.
Thank you.
again.
And thank you to staff. It was, as you imagine, a full staff effort.
Excellent. Thank you again. So we're going to move on now to 4.2, the CEO report.
Thank you. And just to close out on the triennial, I would echo the compliments to Dina, who led the work, and to all the staff. There was a great deal of effort on their parts, pulling together records to make sure that we could document compliance with these things. So thank you to Dina and all of the staff. I think this is also important because you may recall, sometimes I use this triennial review as evidence for you in the monitoring reports, that this is one of those low bars that I said, hey, the FTA is okay with leashes. So, all right, heads up. Okay, CEO report. I'm gonna work leashes into an interpretation somehow, just so you catch it. It's an Easter egg. Okay, so CEO report, nothing but good news to add. I'm very happy to announce that we will have a new HR manager in mid-November. Ms. Monica Boot will be retiring from Washtenaw County and shuffling across town to join us. We're very excited to have someone of her caliber and experience. We look forward to having her in just before Thanksgiving. Propulsion study and preparation for your retreat next week. We did go live with our website today, which includes the full propulsion report, information on public meetings and how individuals can provide feedback, and some other, I think, important sort of videos, things we can find that help provide more context to the discussion. All of this is really about engaging the community. We talked about the millage before and how, you know, some people felt unengaged in that conversation. We're learning from that with this one as well. And I'm happy to report we had excellent conversation yesterday evening with our fleet maintenance staff, the mostly gentlemen who turn the wrenches and maintain our buses, who will be most impacted by changes to propulsion technology. And I was very pleased this morning to chat with some of them. There's still a variety of opinions among that group about the technologies, but they are very engaged. And I think this is an excellent direction to be heading in, particularly when we think about the staff survey, which is also evidence I give you in some monitoring reports and wanting to make sure staff feel more invested in decisions. I want to compliment Gretchen Johnson, who's on the call, and Dina. They submitted a grant application. One of the pop-up grants that came out of the bipartisan infrastructure law had to do with carbon reduction. We did submit two grant requests to SEMCOG for this money. It sort of came up. She had to move very quickly, and thank you to Gretchen and staff who worked on that. We sought money to help pay for bus replacements, and if perhaps that doesn't work, to help pay for the Washtenaw Avenue Express bus. We might actually be able to get the feds to pay operating costs, which is a very rare occasion, which would allow us to extend the millage dollars into other areas. So that's a very positive thing. We'll let you know if either of those things works out in our favor. And then finally, we have some new toys in the back. Supply shortages aside, we're very happy to start taking delivery of some new buses. I believe we have 5 new TheRide buses that are getting painted and decaled up and are going to be on the road probably in the next 3 weeks. And 7 of 8 brand new 40-foot Nova buses have been delivered. The 8th one is on its way from upstate New York from the factory, and they are beautiful. They need to have final inspections, have fare boxes installed, commissions, take all the acceptance sort of stuff off, and we hope to have those in service before December, which would be really nice. So take 8 older vehicles, the oldest 8 vehicles out of service, and put some brand new vehicles in, and those will be, as we do with all vehicles, rotated through every route in the system so that all neighborhoods will have an equal chance to enjoy these vehicles. they have that new bus smell. When you get to ride them, Jesse, you'll notice it. So that's it. Thank you very much, and happy to answer any questions.
Anybody on the board have any questions, for Mr. Carpenter? Go ahead, Jesse.
I know I've been the first person to raise my hand on every single thing so far. I'm putting on my rider hat now. A while back, you had mentioned that the buttons on the new buses were kind of a failed experiment, and that they were going to be replaced with the pull cords. But I noticed that hasn't yet happened. Are there are the new buses? Do they have pull cords, and will the pull cords be installed on the first round anytime soon?
I saw pull cords on the new buses, so
All right.
they are there. I also saw buttons, so I think we may have ended up
I
with
don't mind
both.
if they're both there.
Yeah.
There's just a lot of seats that can't reach a button.
I hear you. So the pull cords, I'll need to double check about the retrofitting. I do remember that discussion. I thought that was a pretty invasive promise that we made to actually disassemble the bus to put the pull cord back in. I need to go double check that for you, but I'll make a note, Deb, to double check the original 8 Nova buses, whether or not retrofitting a pull cord is a viable option, because I want to make sure we're clear about that going forward.
Anyone else? Jesse, you brought up exactly what I was going to ask, and I just want to make sure, in my mind, when we had the discussion about the pull cords and the accessibility issues that we were discussing, that it seemed at that time, it seemed to me that it was a promise. And so I do think that we need to look back at what was said and find out if we can do that retrofit, and if, I really want to see if we can make that happen.
I do recall this conversation. I do believe Brian Smith did commit to you that he would do it. I kind of cringed at that moment because I don't actually know if that was a promise we should have made. Thank you for reminding me. Please let me look. Give me a little time. I'll get back to you on what it will take to do that, and let you know what the plan is going forward. But I do
appreciate
recall that commitment.
Yeah. Nobody else? Wow, we're just ringing it out tonight, aren't we? It's only 8:30. We're on to number 5, emergent items. Does anyone have anything that is emergent? Seeing nothing, we'll go on to 6, closing items. I want to remind everyone that our board retreat is going to be held here at the Ann Arbor District Library from 12:30 to 4:30 p.m. on the 4th floor, Tuesday, October 25th. That is next Tuesday. It's coming up fairly quickly. It is an open meeting. It is open to the public, and you are welcome to either come to the library, or it is hybrid, if I remember correctly. It will be on Zoom, so the public can also engage that way. We hope to see you there. Next is topics for the next meeting. We discussed this evening the follow-up on the policy language of 2.11 construction. So if everybody could put their thinking caps on and have your concerns or new language or whatever, so that we can have a really good, hearty, robust discussion at that time. We also have 2.6 cash and investments, and at that time, we are going to roll out, thank you to the board for accepting the new form. We're going to roll out that new form and give it a good test drive, and we'll do that on 2.6. We have the quarterly 4 service report, the quarter 4 financial report, and then we're going to be looking at board education in regards to federal advocacy. I'm sorry, Matt, go ahead.
Thank you. At your retreat on Tuesday, you have 2 items that you asked us to present. One of them is on bus propulsion. The other is on our legislative/advocacy agenda. In looking at the legislative agenda one, there's 3 broad pieces: local advocacy, state, and federal. Local and federal are probably, frankly, the most important for a transit agency. There is not enough time on Tuesday to tackle those 2 things. So we have pulled Ward. Ward is head of government affairs for the American Public Transit Association, an excellent person to speak to you about federal advocacy. We pulled that out of the retreat. We're going to punt that into a regular board meeting, so the legislative discussion will sort of spread over multiple months. I was speaking with him the other day. I'd actually, if it's all right with the board, like to move that to January rather than a November, and here's why. The local advocacy part, as we'll hear on Tuesday, has a lot of overlap with ownership linkage. And I think Rich said as much this evening. That's going to really bake our noodle. We're going to have to think a lot about how to coordinate our local advocacy agenda. The federal stuff is a little more straightforward. We're going to go to DC and ask for money. Jesse and Mike have accompanied me on virtual junkets to this point. APTA, the American Public Transit Association, has an annual legislative meeting every March where they bring people to DC specifically to go talk to their representatives. I would like to have Ward come and talk to you in January, so it's fresh on our minds, and we are marching forward to March with that discussion in mind. So putting a little space, I guess, between the local advocacy and the federal advocacy, and not kind of mixing them up in the immediate term. So if it's all right, I'd like to push Ward to January.
I think that's a reasonable request. Is there any dissension, or do we feel that that's reasonable? All right, let's go ahead and make that so for January. Are there any topics that we've missed for next month? No? Okay. So we're back to 6.3, public comment. If you wish to address the board during public comment, please, if you're entering in by computer, raise your hand icon at the bottom of your screen, and the technician will see your raised hand, and they'll read off either your name or the last 3 digits of your phone number when your line has unmuted. If you are joining us by phone, please press *9 when the chair, well, I'm already asking for public comment. I'm sorry, I'm reading a script. I should have done better. The technician will read your name or the last 3 digits of your phone number when your line has been unmuted. Deb, do we have anybody available for public comment at this time?
We do Robert Palowski, and he is unmuted.
Go ahead, Robert.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Madam Chair. Good evening, everyone. Robert Plowski again from Southgate, Wayne County. Let me touch on Kathleen's point. It's your first day. You'll get used to it. But I want to dive into the triennial review, and I want to thank Dina and the entire team for all the hard work they put in throughout this process and getting this ready for the board and also the FTA. The one thing that catches my mind on the triennial review is item number 2. And when we dive into the future projects, the transit signal priority technology. Now, I'm surprised that we haven't started this a lot earlier, just like BRT. The transit signal priority was something I think that should have been done in 2019, but I mean, we're getting to it now, but now when we have this discussion of the separation of making a major investment on the US 23 and Washtenaw Avenue intersection for buses to have transit priority lanes that bypass the traffic, that's a start. But in certain areas, and I don't know if any public has approached you on certain areas that need it, but I think we need to start looking into an analysis study, not just in Ann Arbor, but in Ypsi Township, in Ypsi, especially around the Eastern Michigan University. We need to start looking at that. And personally, I think Eastern Michigan University is one of the second biggest areas in the Ann Arbor-Ypsi region that full-blown needs it, besides Washtenaw and Huron Parkway, because rush hour traffic, it gets horrible. Just when you get past the County Farm Park, it's line all the way down to US 23. So I would suggest the board and also the staff to really look into this as more as a 4-year to a 3-year project than really considering it as a 3 to 5 year project once we go into the next review, because this is something that really needs to be looked into, and we need to really look at the traffic. Either we start implementing park and ride lots, or we start putting more transit priority signals in the area. I'm not saying that we should put them everywhere. I think we should just put them in certain spots that really have traffic congestion, because this is really a major problem in Washtenaw County, especially with Washtenaw and Huron Parkway and towards Arborland. We need to start really looking at that. But other than that, it was a really done triennial review. Thank you, Dina, for all the work you've done, and really look forward to best work going into this next fiscal year. But other than that, that's all I have, and I look forward to speaking with you guys at the board retreat. Thank you.
Deb, is there anyone else?
Nope, no one else tonight.
Okay, that will close public comment. And now it is time for adjournment. Do I have a motion? Susan, seconded by Simi. All in favor? Nobody opposed? Beautiful, we are adjourned.